Welcome to Chapter 4 and Market Segmentation, Targeting, and Positioning. In this chapter, we'll talk about how companies go about selecting a market, how we divide the market into different segments, how we choose which segments to target with marketing strategies, and then how to position the product for those target consumers. Okay, so this is in my lectures. This is sort of how I always explain target markets, not in your textbook. So you may want to listen and kind of take notes on this. So this is everybody in the world. And the important thing to understand is when you are marketing a product or a service, never say that everyone is your customer. Because the reality is that's a very short-sighted view on who your market actually is. Your market is a subset of the world, but they're people with the desire and the ability to engage in an exchange relationship with you or your company. So there may be people outside of this rectangle that simply don't have the ability to transact with you. Maybe they don't have the money, maybe they don't have the ability to communicate with you. They might desire your product, but have no way of getting it. So this rectangle becomes very important for you to identify as an organization. Who are those with the desire and the ability to exchange? Now, from this rectangle, we divide that rectangle up into different market segments. And we'll discuss how we do that in this chapter. So if we divide into segments, in this example, there's 6 final segments. Now, again, that doesn't mean that an organization has to try to appease each of these segments. The segments intentionally are separated because they have differences between them in some way. Maybe they want a different product. Maybe they want a different price point. Maybe they want a different feature. Maybe they need to be addressed with a different promotional or communication strategy. So from there, companies usually identify one or more segments as their targets. So by understanding this, what we see is that all target markets are also market segments. So these stars are also segments. However, not all market segments are necessarily a target market. So those 4 boxes that are not starred are segments of your market, but they are not being addressed by your particular marketing strategy right now, or maybe ever. So you can think about this, for example, in a very kind of generic way. Think about toothpaste. So if the world, if there's everyone in the world, not everyone has the desire or the ability to transact with you for your toothpaste. So think about babies that have no teeth, they don't need toothpaste yet. Think about old people with dentures. Maybe they don't need toothpaste either. So inside of our rectangle of those with the desire and ability to buy toothpaste, we may then engage in market segmentation, which means dividing up that market, and then identifying particular segments that are attractive to our organization or our product in particular. So if you think about, again, toothpaste, you might be a niche product. Like think about Sensodyne. Sensodyne is a niche toothpaste that really aims at addressing the needs of people with sensitive teeth and gums. So those are not going to be every single person who brushes their teeth. It's not going to be every single person that's in that market. Likewise, you might have also a niche product on the opposite age scale of Aquafresh, which is the red, white, and blue toothpaste that comes out of a pump that is, often geared towards children. It might have a bubblegum flavor. And from those perspectives, again, you're not going to reach everybody with that product, but you're reaching a segment of the total market with your product, price, place, and promotional strategy. So again, not all market segments are going to be your target market. but all target markets are also market segments. Let's continue. So the chapter will talk about market segmentation and how that then proceeds to identifying target segments for your strategy. And then we'll go into how to position your brand for those target markets. So why do we do that? Well, many markets are demand driven, which we've talked about previously. And what we find is that customers and consumers are more demanding, and they might have more specific demands that require them to be addressed with a different marketing mix. So sometimes consumer groups actually segment themselves naturally into different groupings based on what they want. And so there are very few mass markets that remain. So again, that's why when I hear startup companies saying everybody is my market, or everybody will want my product, I disagree and I challenge and reject that, because what we find is that it's very difficult to try to be everything to everyone in the market. And that segmentation really allows a company to be much more focused on their strategy and reach those consumers that really have a need for your product or service. So what we call market segmentation is simply the process of dividing up a total market into different subgroups. And each of those segments will share similar characteristics with people within that segment, but they will be different in some qualitative way from people in another segment. So the whole purpose of dividing that larger rectangle up into 6 smaller rectangles is because those 6 subsequent groups are going to react differently in some way from one of the other segments, okay? So if there's no differences between your segments in either the description of the segments, in what they want out of your product, in their location, in their strategy, then don't divide them, okay? We only divide into segments when we believe that those segments have a different response to a marketing activity. So we have homogeneous people within a segment and heterogeneity across segments. That said, we want our segments to be measurable, homogeneous within, heterogeneous across, substantial enough to be profitable, accessible, meaning we can reach them with marketing materials, and operational in some way. And our consumer segmentation bases are described in detail in your chapters, and I'm going to give you some examples of each in the subsequent slides. But we have demographic segmentation, so we can divide our market up based on demographic or measurable characteristics of the consumers. Geography, where those consumers are, a combination of geography and demographics. Psychographics, which is dividing your market based on psychological differences between your consumers. Mediographic, differences between how they respond to different promotional messaging. And then behavioral segmentations based on what they are planning to do with your product, how they plan to use your product, what their past experience with your product has been, what features they look for, etc. So ultimately, in these first categories, we're really talking about describing the consumer, whereas this last category is really more about describing how the customer uses the product. I'll explain that in more detail in the coming slides. Let's talk about demographic segmentation. That is dividing a market into segments based on measurable variables, such as age, life cycle stage, gender, income, occupation, education, religion, ethnicity, and generation. And we can ultimately do this using the US Census Bureau's information, and it's the most common segmentation strategy. Let me just open up the census website for you so you can see that, first of all, there's a population clock that is continuously running on the on the page. If we click on that, we will actually see the ticker. So every time a baby is born, let me make this just a little smaller so you can see that obviously the world population is rising much faster than the US population. This is also a way that I demonstrate how really having a domestic only strategy is not very growth-based necessarily, because the US population is less than 5% of the global population. And we'll get to that later on in some chapters subsequently. But you could see that we are only the third largest country behind China and India, and other countries are growing exponentially. But also on this website, the census website has a ton of additional information. It has not only a lot of demographic information, raw data, visualizations. So you see diversity, ethnicity, income, location, aging, population changes. You could also scroll all the way down to the bottom, and that there's a ton of other information choices here, statistics for stories, blogs. Up top, you can get more information for different surveys that they do, which we'll talk about in the next lecture. But we see information. You can download raw data from the census as well, the 2010, as well as from the intermediary updated census numbers that they pull in all the time. And then you'll even see that there's business surveys, there's consumer surveys, and it's really a large amount of information that the US Census actually collects. And you could download that data and do some really interesting, fun things with it if you are so interested. So that is the most common segmentation strategy. Then we have geographic segmentation. And this is important because it's dividing a market up into different geographical units, such as nations, states, regions, counties, cities, or neighborhoods. And that census website can also allow you to do geographic segmentation. And so this geographic segmentation would be important for identifying certain products that are better targeted to certain parts of the world, in certain parts of the country, in our case. And this is also geographic segmentation important for local businesses to understand who lives within their, a radius of their business. And then one of my favorite types of segmentation is actually a combination of both geographic and demographic segmentation. And if you simply Googled PRISM, P-R-I-Z-M, for zip market segmentation, you're going to get a link to a company called Claritas, which is actually now owned by Nielsen. And when we go to this website, I've done over here, you could actually look up your zip code and identify people within that zip code. So let me just throw in Fayetteville, North Carolina here. And what you see, and again, I'm going to make that smaller so we can kind of identify, is first of all, you'll see some quick facts emerge over here and at the bottom. And these are actually just simply demographic visualizations. So we have income, composition, population by age, and population by race and ethnicity. But then up here, do you see these 5 categories? These 5 categories are the most common geographic segments that are represented in this zip code. Let's take a look at those segments in more detail by clicking on the top segment details. But let's remember what number is here, 53, low-tech singles. Just remember that for just a minute. So when we look at these segments, what has happened is that this company over the years, Claritas, has divided the entire United States based on geographic and demographic and graphic and mediographic and et cetera, into a total of 68 different categories. And those, so I believe that was low-tech singles was represented in Fayetteville. If we click on that, by the way, this preliminary information on these top 5 segments is all free. But what happens then is that this gives you a snapshot of this particular type of consumer. This is a consumer that is mature, without children, older households, centered mainly in nation's second cities, below average in their technology use, choosing instead a night out at a restaurant as their evening entertainment. And what we see here, sorry, I zoomed in accidentally. I meant to, I zoomed out. I meant to zoom in. And what we have here is a representation of where these groups live around the United States. So even though we are located in Fayetteville, there are other counties in which this group live. So if we have a product that is aimed at this particular type of consumer, this information will tell us where that consumer lives. So we could choose to do a zip code based media strategy with flyers or mailers. We may decide to open up a business in these top 5 counties where this particular segment lives. And we might also choose to combine this information about demographics with information about lifestyle and media traits. So they shop at Big Lots, they eat at Golden Corral, they own a Kia. And in this case, again, this tells you how you can reach this particular market more specifically if this is a segment that you want to pursue as a target. Again, this information is completely free, and you could get at least the top 5 segments in your particular geographic location. And so I really like this tool. Of course, companies can buy this tool and get a lot more detailed information. And this is just an example in your lecture notes of how to describe how deep these descriptions get of the different segments, and how we can use this information to really develop a much more specific marketing plan to reach these individuals. Now, psychographic segmentation is a little more challenging because psychographic information also involves not only the psychology of how people think, but also their values, their self-concept, and their lifestyles. And this is harder to measure. So think about, how would we measure this information? How do you know if the exact same family composition, a working father, a working mother with 3 teenage kids, how do we know if there are 2 homes exactly next to each other, how one home, what their values are versus the other home, or what one lifestyle is with regard to buying behavior versus the other? And so in this case, when we're looking at psychographic segmentation, we often have to delve into these segments with a little more marketing research effort. And marketing research is covered in Chapter 5. The text also talks about a VALS, or a value-based measure of what people's primary motivations are and which of these groups they belong to. And again, if you type in the VALS, V-A-L-S survey into Google, you would be able to take this test yourself and see where you fall into in terms of these value-based categories. And then I would challenge you to think about how a company would appeal to different entities within this VALS framework. So all of those different measurable consumer-based ways of segmenting the market are all fine and good. But now we're going to shift gears and talk more about behavioral ways to segment the market. based on the buying situation. So, whoops, I apologize, that's in white, but that says benefits sought. And some products are marketed based on the benefits that consumers desire from using it. So for example, this is an example of segmenting a bicycle market. These would be people with the desire and the ability to engage or buy a bicycle. But if we divide the market based on what they're going to use the bicycle for, you can see that this type of segmentation is qualitatively different than dividing the market based on demographic or geographic or psychographic bases that we've discussed previously. Here, we're segmenting the market based on what the customer is going to do with the product. So this would be a benefits sought or buying situation segmentation. And this is really important as well. We could divide the market based on how much they use your product. So this would be usage rate as a segmentation tool. And so here, this is important because we know from the 80-20 Pareto rule that about 80% of revenue for a company is often generated by the top 20% of their customers. So identifying who these heavy users are, how to reach them, what they want from your product, what pricing strategy to use with them, etc., is going to be really important for your firm. So this is dividing the market based on usage. Here are some additional ways to use behavioral segmentation, loyalty status, and then your text talks about the purchase occasion, so why you're buying it. As I mentioned, benefits sought, usage rate, user status. Readiness stage is interesting. Like, are they ready to go ahead and make that purchase decision, or are they going to wait a little longer? Are they deferring their choice? Attitudes to the product. So this is different than psychographic or values-based segmentation, and is rather looking at attitudes towards the product. So again, you can see that these behavioral segmentation bases are less about the consumer and more oriented towards the product or the situation in which you're going to use the product. And we talked about involvement and adopter type in Chapter 3. Of course, what normally happens is that companies use a combination of these kinds of segmentation variables. We might use age, we might use social, we might use product segmentation. And then overlapping those Venn diagrams, you could get a very more focused, targeted strategy towards this niche market. Similar to Chapter 3, just shifting gears and looking a little bit more at the business market, the business-to-business market, we can use a lot of these same tools to segment business markets or do organizational segmentation. We can do that at the macro level or the micro level. The macro level is, again, looking at the geography. So where is the geographic location of the business? What type of organization is it? By industry grouping or business sector, and even customer size. So again, this would be like taking the market of potential businesses as your customer and dividing those businesses up based on where they're located, based on what kinds of organizations they are. And so very measurable. You'll notice these macro are quite measurable aspects of the business. And then micro segmentation is more about how the business is going to interact with yours. So user status, trade category, what benefits they're looking for in your product, loyalty, readiness, adopter, purchasing practices, and buying class. So again, you can see in both of these instances, whether we're segmenting individual customers or segmenting businesses, we often use a combination of variables to divide up that rectangle of the market into smaller rectangles or segments, and then identifying which of those segments is going to be starred for your target market. This graph, it is in your text. It's called a nested approach to B2B segmentation. But I also believe that we could use the exact same type of graph or image to describe customer segmentation as well. So demographic variables, operating variables, purchasing approach, situational factors, and personal characteristics. Those can apply to the business or they can apply to a person. Now, all of that I just talked about is really about dividing up that bigger rectangle. And now we're going to figure out how to star or identify the stars that we'll search. So these targeting strategies can be undifferentiated marketing, meaning that you divided your market up, but you're basically going to use the exact same approach to reaching your target markets. In differentiated marketing, this is where you're proposing different strategies for different segments. Concentrated marketing and niche marketing are quite similar. You can read about the differences in them in your textbook, but ultimately what you're doing is identifying a marketing strategy. And then customized marketing is really one-to-one and more challenging, certainly more expensive, absolutely, but it could be reaching a potential lucrative subset of the entire market that is not being reached by another product or service. So as we decide whether or not we're going to star one of those segments, we have to ask ourselves a couple of questions. Is it sufficient to bring profit? Does it have potential for growth? Can my brand or product actually compete in that segment? Are there barriers to entry or exit? Are there unsatisfied needs of the customer or the business that the company can serve? And then once we understand that, now we have to delve deeper into that starred segment and ask ourselves, how does our brand fit into the minds of those consumers relative to other competing brands in that space? One of the ways we do this is called perceptual mapping. And basically, what we're doing here is identifying dimensions on which customers categorize brands. So this is just an example of a car market, and this is very generically formed, okay? But let's say we have price going from low to high and style going from traditional to contemporary. And the way that we do perceptual mapping is we ask customers how similar one brand is to another. And then we use a statistical tool to actually create these maps of similarity. So all we're asking consumers to do is to, for example, tell us, how similar do you think Kia is to Ford? How similar is Kia to Toyota? How similar is Toyota to Ford? And so on. So it's every pairwise comparison of brands. From that information, we create a multi-dimensional map, something like this. Now, the researchers are the ones who label the dimensions. These are not dimensions necessarily that customers were using when they said, yes, Kia is similar to Ford, but Kia is very different than BMW, for example. So the closer brands are on a perceptual map, the more competitive they are. Because again, remember, this is what the customers think. So customers think Kia is more similar to Ford and Toyota than Kia is to BMW and Cadillac. From here, we can combine information about brands with information about the target market size. So basically, these circles are dependent on understanding what the target market wants in terms of these features. When these are layered over our brands, what we can see here is that certainly there are brands that appeal to each of these target markets. But what we see is that perhaps we want to be more competitive, meaning that we want to reach a larger potential market. In this case, we would want to perhaps reposition our brand to look more like a Buick in the minds of customers. Okay, so this doesn't necessarily have to be reality. This can be just simply in Kia's choice of which brands to differentiate or which brands to even mention in competitive advertisements. So if Kia starts mentioning Buick all the time in their advertisements, customers will perhaps start to perceive that Kia is more similar to a Buick and therefore may choose to consider a Kia when they're looking for moderately priced, moderately styled vehicles. Your book is another example of soaps and combines the ideas of the brands. Here, all the brands are numbered 1 through 12. The green stars are ideal positions, and the yellowish lettered circles are possible market gaps. And this is really interesting because this might identify an opportunity. So when we combine perceptual maps with SWOT analyses, we get often opportunities for growth, opportunities for new product designs, opportunities for differentiated marketing communications, so how we promote the product differentially. And then we position some different types of positioning strategies are to position our product relative to other brands in the consumer's consideration set based on different product features, based on price or quality, based on when we would use those products, what benefits those products meet for the target market. We can use user-based positioning strategies or competitive-based strategies, meaning that you are directly placing your brand and your competing brand in the same advertisement potentially. Or you can oftentimes look at competing with a completely different product class. And you can see that in many examples when companies try to reposition themselves. For example, McDonald's attempts to move towards a healthier position in people's perceptions. So they changed a lot of their actual environmental stores. So almost all of the McDonald's stores in my area have been undergoing renovation to look more like a coffee shop, less like a fast food restaurant, having it a bit more like a cafe style. And you see that in their positioning as well, because they know that they're losing customers to more healthy potential options. So they're trying to reposition themselves to stay competitive for those segments that prioritize health over other potential product qualities. So as we go through this process of segmenting, targeting, and positioning, we're identifying the total market. That's that larger rectangle that I identified in the very first slide. We're dividing that rectangle up into smaller market segments. Of those market segments, we're selecting a target market or target markets. We're understanding what competitors there are for each of those target markets. And we're establishing our own position in consumers' minds using positioning strategies. So in this chapter, we talked about how markets are people, not products, and that a product should be targeted at specific segments. So don't try to be everything to everyone. That doesn't work. We often use multivariable segmentation, and segmenting, it gives us opportunities to differentiate our product. Segmentation and the process of choosing which segments to target also gives us opportunities for more clearer positioning and more specific marketing strategies. That's it for this chapter, and look for our next chapter lecture on market research.